The sun beat down mercilessly on the parched Wyoming territory, its rays turning the endless prairie into a shimmering mirage of heat and dust. Jacob Thornton wiped the sweat from his weathered brow with the back of his hand, squinting against the harsh light as he surveyed his land. The grass, once green and lush in spring, now stood brown and brittle, crackling underfoot like dried bones. In the distance, the barren hills rose up against the cloudless sky, their rocky faces carved by wind and time into monuments of desolation. His modest wooden house sat like a lonely sentinel on the vast expanse, its unpainted boards weathered to the color of old silver. The structure was simple: 4 walls, a pitched roof, and a stone chimney that leaked smoke when the wind blew from the north. Beside it stood the barn, equally austere, housing his dwindling herd of cattle. The well, dug deep into the unforgiving earth, yielded less water with each passing week as the drought tightened its grip on the land. Jacob lived alone, had done so for 3 years now since Martha died of the fever. The silence of the prairie had become his only companion, broken occasionally by the lowing of cattle or the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. At 35, he was still young enough to rebuild, old enough to know the weight of loss. His hands, calloused from years of working rope and leather, trembled slightly as he held the letter he'd written the night before. The words were simple, practical, the kind a man writes when he's not accustomed to flowery language or romantic notions. He needed a wife, plain and simple, not for love or companionship in the way the poets wrote about, but for survival. Someone to help with the endless chores, to share the burden of keeping the ranch alive through another brutal winter. Someone who wouldn't expect too much from a man who'd already given his heart to the grave. "Dear Sir," the letter began, addressed to the matrimonial agency in St. Louis he'd seen advertised in a month-old newspaper. "I am seeking a practical woman of good character to join me as wife on my ranch in Wyoming territory. She need not be young or comely, only hard-working and of quiet disposition. I can offer a solid roof, adequate provisions, and fair treatment. I am not given to drink or violence. Please forward this to any suitable candidate who might consider such an arrangement." He deliberately emphasized his desire for a plain bride, someone who wouldn't draw attention or create complications. Beautiful women brought trouble. He'd seen it enough times in the small town 15 miles east. They stirred men's passions, created jealousies, disturbed the delicate balance of frontier life. What he needed was a partner, not an ornament. Someone sturdy and sensible, who understood that life out here was about endurance, not romance. Standing on his porch, Jacob looked out at the empty road that wound its way through the sagebrush toward town. Once a week, he made the journey for supplies, enduring the suspicious glances and whispered conversations that followed him. They called him the Hermit now, though he'd once been welcomed at every social gathering. But grief had changed him, turned him inward like a flower closing against the cold. The townspeople had their own prejudices, their own rigid ideas about how life should be lived. A man without a woman was suspect, incomplete. Yet a man who sought a wife through advertisement was equally questionable. It was a dance of propriety that Jacob had long since tired of performing. Let them whisper. Let them judge. Out here, with only the wind and the wolves for company, their opinions mattered less than dust. As evening approached, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Jacob sealed the letter with candle wax. Tomorrow, he would ride to town and post it, setting in motion a future he could barely imagine. In his mind, he pictured a sturdy woman of middle years, perhaps widowed like himself, with capable hands and a face marked by sun and hardship. Someone who wouldn't expect tender words or gentle touches, who would understand that some wounds never fully healed. The coyotes began their nightly chorus as darkness crept across the land. Jacob checked the locks on the barn, made sure the chickens were secure in their coop, and pumped fresh water for the morning. These rituals, performed alone for so long, might soon be shared. The thought brought neither joy nor dread, merely a sense of practical satisfaction. This was survival. Nothing more. Inside the house, He lit the oil lamp and sat at the rough-hewn table where he took his solitary meals. The empty chair across from him seemed to mock his decision, reminding him of all he'd lost and all he dared not hope to find again. He pushed away such thoughts. Hope was a luxury he could no longer afford. What he needed was help, plain and simple. A pair of hands to share the work. A presence to fill the echoing silence. As he prepared for bed, Jacob allowed himself one moment of weakness, one fleeting prayer to whatever power might be listening. Let her be plain, he thought. Let her be ordinary and unremarkable. Let her bring no beauty to tempt him, no grace to make him forget his vows to the dead. Let her be exactly what he'd asked for. Nothing more, nothing less. The prairie wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending dust through every crack and crevice. Somewhere in the darkness, a wolf called to its pack, the sound lonely and wild. Jacob pulled the rough blanket over his shoulders and closed his eyes, unaware that fate had already begun to laugh at the simple plans of practical men. 6 weeks had passed since Jacob posted his letter. 6 weeks of drought and dwindling hope. Then came the telegram, brief and businesslike. Bride arriving Tuesday noon stop, meet at station stop agency. Tuesday dawned clear and merciless, the sun already fierce by mid-morning. Jacob dressed in his best clothes, a clean white shirt, dark trousers, and the jacket he'd worn to Martha's funeral. His boots, polished to an unfamiliar shine, felt strange on his feet as he hitched the horses to the wagon. The 15-mile journey to town stretched before him like a lifetime. The settlement of Willow Creek barely deserved the name town, a collection of weather-beaten buildings clustered around a single dusty street. The general store, the saloon, the modest church with its crooked steeple, and the new railway station that connected this forgotten corner of Wyoming to the wider world. As Jacob's wagon rolled down Main Street, he could feel the eyes upon him, see the curtains twitch in windows, hear the sudden hush of conversations. "That's him," someone whispered. "Thornton, getting himself a mail-order bride?" "About time," another voice replied. "Man's been alone too long. Ain't natural." By the station platform, a small crowd had already gathered. News traveled fast in Willow Creek, and the arrival of a stranger, especially a woman, was entertainment enough to draw folks from their daily routines. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house stood with her daughter, both dressed in their Sunday best. The Garrison brothers leaned against the station wall, passing a flask between them despite the early hour. Even Reverend Collins had found reason to be present, Bible clutched in his pale hands. Jacob tied his horses and took his place on the platform, aware of every glance, every whispered comment. The minutes crawled by like hours. Then, in the distance, a plume of black smoke appeared, followed by the mournful whistle of the approaching train. The locomotive thundered into the station with a great hissing of steam and squealing of brakes. Passengers began to disembark. Traveling salesmen with their cases, a family heading further west, an elderly woman clutching a carpet bag. Jacob searched each face, looking for the plain, practical woman he'd imagined. Perhaps she'd changed her mind. Perhaps. Then she appeared. She stood framed in the doorway of the passenger car, one gloved hand resting on the rail, and time seemed to stop. The crowd fell silent, a collective intake of breath, the only sound above the engine's dying hiss. She was young, far younger than he'd expected, with hair the color of autumn wheat pinned beneath a simple traveling hat. Her dress, though modest in cut and fabric, couldn't disguise the graceful lines of her figure, but it was her face that struck like a physical blow, fine-boned and delicate, with eyes the color of sage honey and lips that needed no rouge to enhance their natural rose. Dear God, someone behind Jacob breathed. Would you look at that? She descended the steps with careful dignity, a single trunk her only luggage. When her feet touched the platform, she looked up, scanning the crowd with those remarkable eyes until they found Jacob. He knew he should move, should step forward and introduce himself, but his legs had turned to stone. The thought blazed through his mind like wildfire. He expected a plain bride, but the beauty who arrived made him fear his own desire. Somehow, he forced himself forward. "Miss..." He realized he didn't even know her full name. The agency had only provided initials, E.M. "Miss Foster," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Emma Foster. You must be Mr. Thornton." He managed a nod, acutely aware of the crowd pressing closer, of the whispers rising like buzzing flies. She can't be serious. "Mrs." Henderson hissed to her daughter. "A woman like that, marrying Jacob Thornton. Must be running from something," one of the Garrison brothers suggested, loud enough for all to hear. "Or hiding something. No decent woman that looks like that needs to answer advertisements." Emma's chin lifted slightly, but she gave no other sign she'd heard. She kept her eyes on Jacob. Waiting. "My wagon's this way," he managed, reaching for her trunk. Their hands brushed as they both grasped the handle, and he jerked back as if burned. The walk to the wagon felt like miles, with half the town following at a discreet distance. Questions hung in the air, unspoken but heavy as storm clouds. Why would a woman of such beauty choose this path? What secrets drove her to answer an advertisement for a plain bride to a lonely rancher? The speculation began before they'd even left the platform. "Mark my words. Mrs." Henderson announced to anyone within earshot. "That woman brings trouble. Beauty like that always does." As Jacob helped Emma onto the wagon seat, he caught a glimpse of something in her eyes, a weariness that seemed at odds with her youth, a guarded quality that spoke of walls built high and strong. She sat straight-backed beside him, hands folded in her lap, saying nothing as he guided the horses out of town. Behind them, Willow Creek buzzed with gossip. The pretty new bride of the hermit rancher would be the talk for weeks to come. Men would find excuses to ride out past the Thornton place. Wives would watch their husbands with narrowed eyes. The delicate balance of their small community had been disturbed, just as Jacob had feared. The road stretched before them, dusty and long. Emma had pulled her hat low against the sun, casting her features in shadow. She hadn't spoken since leaving the station, hadn't complained about the dust or the heat or the obvious hostility of the townspeople. This silence, which should have pleased him, instead made him unaccountably nervous. "It's not what you expected," he said finally, gesturing at the barren landscape. "I expected nothing," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. "Expectations are luxuries I can no longer afford." The words hung between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Jacob glanced at her profile, saw the tight set of her jaw, the way her fingers gripped each other until the knuckles showed white through her gloves. Whatever had driven her to answer his advertisement, it wasn't the romantic notions of a silly girl. Something had carved away her innocence, left her as guarded as he was. They rode in silence after that, two strangers bound by necessity rather than affection, while the sun beat down and the prairie stretched endlessly before them. Neither spoke of the fears that gnawed at them, his terror of feeling again, hers of whatever shadow had driven her west. They simply endured, as people did in this hard land, putting 1 mile behind them and then another, while the town's whispers faded into the wind. But the damage was already done. Emma Foster's beauty had been seen, noted, judged, in a place where women were scarce and beauty scarcer still. She would be a catalyst for desires and resentments that had long lay dormant. Jacob had wanted a plain bride to avoid complications. Instead, he'd gotten Emma, and with her, all the trouble he'd tried so hard to avoid. The journey back to the ranch seemed endless, the wagon wheels catching in ruts and sending up clouds of red dust that settled on everything. Emma held a handkerchief to her face, but made no complaint as they jolted along the rough track. The vast sky pressed down upon them, a dome of relentless blue that offered no mercy from the afternoon sun. As they climbed a rise, Jacob gestured ahead,